Next question is, so with this whole model of how Hashem is sort of playing the roles of all these different people in the world, and each of us is sort of like a fragment or a fraction version of Hashem's self, sort of searching for himself, really. So how do you fit in people who are very evil, like Ted Bundy or Adolf Hitler, people like that? These are very, very bad people. So how do they fit into the scheme of this? If like that means that any person is sort of like an aspect of Hashem, how could somebody become like that if they're an aspect of Hashem at the same time? How does that work? See, this is the problem with giving a shiur on like fundamental concepts. You end up getting the most fundamental types of questions. Each one requires its own talk. Okay, I'm going to do a short answer for this also. It's going to be like an attempt to do something crazy and it's like a 3-minute thing. But your question is amazing, obviously. It's a great question. The short answer is that what happens is a Ted Bundy type person is a person where you have the examples that we gave, where there are now, is you start getting too attached to an aspect of your character, right? So let's just use Ted Bundy as an example. Again, we don't know this guy. I don't know exactly what was going on in his head, but let's just pick one nuance of what he did, right? Clearly a very sexually oriented set of mistakes and problems that he was making, and then he would murder people. And so basically, let's give a theory. Maybe he was very, very prominently in his mind attaching his sense of identity to his sexual experiences and sensations. And then whenever those things weren't being fulfilled in a way that he felt was fully who he was, then he started to feel like his life was empty and lacking. And then he would like lash out based on that and try to fix that in some way and try to make things different. So if you keep doing that repeatedly, so he had a particularly damaging way because that actually impacts other people's lives. But you can also do that in much smaller, less impactful ways. Like if you repeatedly relate to food, let's say using my wedding example, if you repeatedly relate to weddings as being gigantic food parties where there's also a couple getting married, and the way they're getting married is whatever the concept of marriage is, you know, in the secular society, in the world, whatever people say, marriage is just two people who love each other just getting married, and we all know what that means without ever really thinking through what exactly is that. So the accumulation of repeatedly thinking that way, and you're sort of thickening the perceptions, the pair of glasses through which you're viewing the wedding concept. So over time, it gets more and more and more and more distorted until eventually you get to a point where like it'll cause you to actually make really, really bad decisions. Like you might even get married in a very messed up way with a very messed up type of situation because of this repeated way of thinking. And these are not small effects. Like that's, you know, it seems like it's not a big deal, but it's like people who have gone through that and then gotten, you know, divorced or whatever problems they have in their lives and their relationships, it comes from some combination of those kinds of distortions. So what that means is that the problem that I'm raising here, when you start to confuse who you are on a character level with who you really are, it leads to you making very, very incremental mistakes over time that eventually get expressed as gigantic problems, creates a crisis of some kind, and your life either falls apart or you have to kind of figure out how to fix it or get it back on track. So Ted Bundy and, you know, Adolf Hitler, Yamach Shemo as an example, these are people who are famous to us because they did such intense, damaging things. But what they did was they just kept going on a path that was more and more and more distorted. It got more and more and more layered over time until eventually they were no longer able to even do that anymore. And then there's a deeper question, which is like, well, if there's an aspect of Hashem manifest through every one of these characters, well, what happens to the aspect of Hashem that was like inside of a person like that, that's linked to a Hitler body character or a Ted Bundy? And that's also a much longer discussion, which is also related to the death discussion. But the short answer to your question is that the thing that you are, the real you, is endless and can never really be damaged by those types of choices. But the more the character takes over and you sort of allow your character to dominate who you really are and bring you more and more away from who you really are, the more existential angst you're going to feel, the more bad decisions you're going to make over time, the more you're going to damage yourself, and the more your life is going to start to give you red flags, pushing you back away from that. And if you ignore those red flags, eventually you'll just stop being able to see them anymore, and then you're just kind of done, and then you turn into, you know, kind of like a bizarro version of yourself, to use a random term if I can. All right. That kind of answer that, sort of? All right. Other questions? Anything else? Okay, Izzy.